I was 76 years old when the bulldozers came to tear down the house I had built with my own hands. My neighbors stood at the fence line, silent and tight-lipped, as the crew boss raised his arm, and the first wall gave way. The sign on the road said Dutton Ridge Luxury Homes, Phase 1. I stood at the ditch in a faded denim jacket and a hat that had known too many summers. Mark Dutton, neat hair and a smile that never touched his eyes, approached me like a man greeting a servant instead of a neighbor. "Progress," he said. "You'll see, Mr. Walker. This town will thank me." I did not answer. I watched the machines crawl over my yard, watched the porch swing drop with a short clatter, watched the dust climb. My dog, Rusty, pressed against my leg. A deputy stood nearby, hands on his belt. "You were told, Mr. Walker," he said, as if I could be scolded into forgetting. At sunset, when the machines went quiet and the workers trudged to their trucks, I looked across the scraped earth to the stand of young pines that hid the hill. Under that hill, my father had once shown me a map, a web of old mine tunnels, timber posts, and the drainage valves that still turned if a man had patience and a wrench. "This land ain't empty," my father had told me long ago. "It remembers." I put my hand on Rusty's head. "We're going home," I said softly. "But not the way they think." There was a storm coming. Only it wasn't in the sky. I grew up on the Walker farm, a patchwork of fields and tree lines stitched together by a narrow creek. As a boy, I learned to fix fences with wire and a steady hand. I learned to stretch a dollar. I learned from a father who measured his days in chores and his nights in quiet. When the old coal mine shut down in the late 60s, my father went down one last time and took notes, as if the dark tunnels were a book he would be tested on. He came home with a map covered in pencil marks and told me, "These hills hold old bones, son. You respect them, or they'll remember you the hard way." I married Mary in a small church with peeling paint. We had 2 children, Emma and Luke. We planted trees the same year the town paved the main road. I lost Mary to an illness when the children were grown. The house felt too big after that, but I filled it with work and the steady company of a dog who never wandered far. Rusty, named by Luke, took to following me from shed to pasture like a shadow with a wagging tail. When land prices climbed, developers circled like hawks. I refused easy cash. I'd point to the small stone marker under the oak where Mary's name was carved. "This is home," I would say. Some years were thin. I sold equipment piece by piece but kept the land. I paid my taxes, kept my fences mended, and helped neighbors when storms pushed branches across the road. Then Mark Dutton arrived with his sharp suits, a smooth pitch, and a wife, Linda, who wore heels to town meetings and called the place an untapped asset. They promised jobs, parks, and a shiny new coffee shop, as if that could replace roots buried deep in this soil. I listened. I shook my head. I went back to my chores. I did not know that saying no would be treated like a crime. At first, it was just talk. Mark Dutton held a meeting at the high school gym and spoke about revitalization. He showed slides, neat rows of homes, a clubhouse, a pool shaped like a teardrop. Linda smiled as if she were selling sunshine. People clapped because the drawings were clean and the numbers were big. I sat quietly in the back with my hat folded in my lap. Then came the pressure. A county inspector appeared, peered at my barn, and wrote, "Unsafe," in red on a notice he tacked to the door. 2 days later another notice arrived about a new zoning rule that redefined agricultural. After 60 straight years of paying my taxes on time, I suddenly received a delinquent notice in the mail. Each mistake corrected required a trip to the courthouse and a fee. I paid what I could. I kept copies in a shoebox, labeled and dated, because that was how I stayed sane. In the diner, a few folks whispered that I was stubborn. Others kept quiet, fearing they would be next. One morning, the water pump wouldn't start. I found a valve down by the road turned the wrong way and a tire track in the soft dirt. I called the county. The county said it must have been a mistake. That night, a truck slowed by the edge of my pasture and someone threw a can at my mailbox. Rusty growled low in his throat. I sat by the window, flashlight in hand, and watched the taillights fade into the dark. The final blow came with a court order. The barn and house were imminent hazards, and must be cleared. A lawyer I could not afford explained that fighting it would take months. By then, the fines would make it impossible anyway. I slept for the last time in my bed with Rusty curled tight nearby. I woke before dawn and packed 2 bags. I locked the door I had built. I stood on the porch and listened to the wind move through the trees that I had planted with Mary. By week's end, the machines arrived. After the demolition, I stayed in a spare room at my neighbor Clara Bell's house. Clara was tough and kind, a widow who ran her place with order and a gentle voice. She offered hot meals and a ride to town when I needed one. I thanked her and tried not to ask for much. At night, I lay awake and stared at the ceiling, tracing the lines of old cracks, wondering when a man's name stopped counting in his own home. My anger did not look like shouting. It sat in my chest, heavy and quiet. I asked myself questions I did not want to ask. Had I failed my children by holding on to land that only caused trouble? Should I have taken the money years ago and moved close to Emma, who lived 3 towns over? Was I fighting a fight that had already been lost? I went to the creek one evening, following the path my boots knew even in the dark, and stood on the bank where I had once taught Luke to skip stones. I thought of Mary's laugh when I missed and the ripples swallowed the sun. "Who am I now?" I whispered, and only Rusty answered, pressing his head against my knee. "A tenant in a borrowed room? An old man with a bag of papers?" I felt small in a way I had not felt even at the funeral. I could not shake the image of the porch swing dropping, the quick clatter, the dust drifting where I used to sit with Mary and count the stars. I tried to imagine a future that did not include that porch, and the picture would not form. Then I remembered the map. The pencil lines. The notes. Valves. Slopes. "This land ain't empty." I could hear my father draw out the words. Respect them. Understand them. A thought took root, not wild, not reckless, but steady. If I could not fight in the open, perhaps I could encourage the land to speak for itself. I went to my shed, the one the county had ignored because it was tucked behind a tree line, and found the metal box under the floorboard. Inside lay the folded map, a compass, a rusted wrench, and a green notebook with my father's careful handwriting. I set the map on Clara's kitchen table that night and smoothed it with both hands. Clara watched me from across the table. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking of old tunnels," I said. "Of water that still moves where it shouldn't. Of timbers that hold only because no one has asked them not to. You'll land yourself in a heap of trouble," Clara warned softly. "Those developers might act friendly with clipboards, but they have lawyers for breakfast." I nodded. "I'm not going to hurt anyone," I said. "I won't set any traps for people. I'm going to let the ground tell the truth." That week, I walked the ridge at night with Rusty at my heel and a small flashlight in my pocket. I found the first valve half buried near an old survey stake. It took time to clear the dirt and turn it, but the metal still obeyed with a stiff groan. Down the hill, I traced a shallow ditch line from the creek to a point above the construction site, where the topsoil had been stripped to clay. I placed small sandbags I had stitched from feed sacks to guide the water if rain came. I did not break a law. I adjusted what was already there. The small victory came 3 days later when a storm passed through and the site flooded ankle-deep, turning the clay to a slick mess. The next morning, workers stomped through ankle-deep mud, cursing and shoveling water that wouldn't leave. Mark Dutton scowled at the damage and pointed as if scolding the earth. They lost 2 days of work. I didn't smile. I simply folded the map back into my pocket and kept walking the lines. The land had moved a little. It could move more. Mark Dutton suspected sabotage. He arrived with a private security guard and 2 foremen and ordered fences raised and cameras mounted. "We are not letting some stubborn farmer slow progress," he said. Linda posted on the town's message board, "Sad to see resistance to growth, but we will prevail." Some townsfolk cheered in the comments, Others went quiet, the kind of quiet that means they're angry. A county official, the same one who had stamped "unsafe" on my barn, filed a complaint claiming I had trespassed near the site. The deputy came to Clara's porch with a clipboard and a polite face. "Just stay away from the construction, Mr. Walker," he said. "Let's not make this worse." "I don't go where I'm not welcome," I replied. It was true. I was letting the land do the talking. Then came the crushing blow. Mark's company filed a civil suit claiming I had interfered with development and cost them money. Clara sat at the kitchen table with me while I read the legal papers and their list of demands. The numbers climbed like a ladder no one could reach. "They want to take everything," Clara whispered. I folded the papers and placed them in the shoebox with the others. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak. I went outside, sat on the step, and put my face in my hands. Rusty lay down beside me with a sigh and watched the empty road. For the first time since the demolition, I felt real defeat, not the quiet kind I could carry, but the heavy, breathless kind that makes a man feel small and late to his own life. The next day at the market, I heard two men laugh that the old fool had picked a fight he could not win. I kept walking. I shook. I did not look up. By evening, I did not trust my hands to hold the map steady. The ground felt unsteady under my boots. I was, for a time, alone. Clara knocked on my door that night and found me at the table, the map open and the green notebook beside it. "Eat," she said, setting a plate down. "Then listen to me." I ate because I did not want to hurt her feelings. When I finished, Clara sat across from me and folded her hands. "You keep looking at that map like it will walk for you. It won't. But you can walk for it." I looked at the notes. The entries were simple: depths, directions, warnings. "Do not disturb timbers on the eastern shaft. Spring line runs shallow near the ridge. Valve C meets valve E at the stone outcrop." A memory rose like something found at the bottom of a drawer. My father's lantern light bouncing off wet walls, the soft drip of water becoming a rhythm, his voice firm. "If men dig without respect, the ground will take its due." I straightened the notebook. "I won't hurt a soul," I said. "That's a line I won't cross." I flipped to a page with a small diagram. "But if they are building on bad bones, the town has a right to know before buyers move in." I spent 2 days walking the ridge and marking quiet points with stones, not chalk, not paint. I measured with steps. I timed the creek's flow after a small rain. I sat with Rusty and watched how puddles formed and drained. Patterns appeared, a hollow under the slope, a slight tremor when heavy trucks passed. The tunnels were near. I gathered small tools: rope, a hand level, stakes, a hand auger. I tested the ground in thin shafts away from the crew and recorded the soil. Clara drove me to the hardware store and paid for what I would not accept as a gift. "Call it a loan," she said. At dusk on the third day, I stood at the crest above the site and knew, the way a farmer knows, that the land was ready to tell the truth if asked the right way. My plan was careful. I traced a triangle on the hill with 3 shallow trenches hidden by brush. I set the feed sack sandbags to channel water from the creek along the old ditch lines my father had mapped. I found the second valve and turned it a quarter, then the third valve near the stone outcrop and turned it half. Not enough to flood in a rush, just enough to soften. I tied a rope around an old stump and lowered myself to an opening where the mine had breathed decades ago. The tunnels lay barely 20 feet below the surface, their clay walls soft, and their timbers old enough to sigh when the ground shook. I did not go inside. I did not break earth. I laid a vibration sensor I had made from a weighted nail, a string, and a small board, a trick my father had taught me for checking if the ground quivered when heavy machines moved. I also went to the courthouse. I filed a request for public records on the inspection reports. I paid the fee with small bills that had been folded and unfolded too many times. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, handed me copies the next day. I found pages missing and dates that did not line up. I did not confront anyone. I made copies and tucked them into the shoebox. On a bright morning, the crew set a row of concrete forms. I watched from the tree line as a backhoe moved across the slope where I knew the tunnel ran shallow. The nail on my board trembled and drew a small line in the dust. I waited. I looked up at the sky, calm, cloudless. The ground could be patient. The timbers would not shout before they failed. They would whisper, then let go. By late afternoon, Mark Dutton walked the site with a tablet in his hand and Linda trailing, taking photos. A foreman pointed to the ridge. Mark glanced up, saw nothing but an old man and a dog, and waved him off. For the first time since this began, I felt the quiet confidence that comes when a plan rests on truth. The first crack formed near a concrete form at dusk. It was hair-thin and curved like a small smile. The collapse didn't come as a roar, but as a long, low groan from the shallow tunnels beneath the slope, softened by days of rain and shaken by the weight of the heavy trucks, a sound I felt in my boots before I ever heard it. A truck rolled forward to pour concrete, and the ground sank 2 inches under the front wheel, then 4, then more, as if the earth took a long breath in and forgot to let it out. Workers shouted and stepped back. The foreman waved his arms. "Stop! Stop!" The hairline crack widened. A section of clay slumped inward and pulled at the rebar. The truck backed up fast, tires spinning, and the corner of the form buckled. Then the slope gave way in a smooth, terrible slide that opened into a dark mouth. No one fell. No one was hurt. The site went still except for the pop of a snapping board. From the ridge I stood very still. Rusty pressed close. Mark ran toward the hole, then froze, staring down into the black mouth where his future had just caved in. "What is this?" he shouted, as if the hill could answer. Within an hour, the county arrived. A geologist from the state came the next morning, helmet on, notes in hand. She peered into the collapse and shook her head. "Old mine workings," she said. "You've been building over voids. This whole section is unstable." She marked an area wider than Mark's Phase 1 plan and said construction must halt. The crew dragged barriers across the road. Camera crews showed up, lights bright, microphones jammed toward anyone with a vest. I did not go down there. I went to the public meeting, though, holding a neat folder. When my turn came, I spoke into the microphone. My voice was calm. "These tunnels were mapped decades ago," I said. "I have notes. I filed records requests that show inspection gaps. Buyers should know the truth before a single family is sold a home that might sink." Mark tried to talk over me, to call me bitter, to call me a saboteur. The geologist cleared her throat. "Sir," she said, "our preliminary findings confirm widespread subsidence risk. If this man has maps, they are evidence. We will need them." I held up the green notebook. The room went quiet. Justice, when it came, was not loud. It was steady. It fit. Over the next month, the state issued a formal report. It cited historical mine maps, surface tests, and the fresh collapse. It recommended halting the entire project and reassessing the land. Buyers who had placed deposits demanded refunds. The bank, spooked by risk and headlines, withdrew financing. The county opened an ethics review into the sudden, unsafe orders on my barn and the zoning changes that seemed written by a hand too close to Mark's office. The official who had stamped the notices resigned. Mark Dutton tried to spin the story, but emails surfaced showing he had been warned about subsidence risks and pushed forward anyway. Linda went quiet online. The sign at the road came down, and with it, the confidence that had ridden into town on polished shoes. I obtained a court order that set aside the demolition record on my house as procedurally flawed. It did not bring the building back, but it cleared my name. A local nonprofit helped me secure a grant to rebuild a small home on a safer part of my acreage, away from the old tunnels. Volunteers showed up with hammers on a Saturday. Clara brought iced tea and kept the crews organized with a list in her neat handwriting. Emma and Luke drove in with their kids. I stood under the new frame and listened to my children talk about memories, the creek, the late-night stars, Mary's song in the kitchen, Rusty's habit of sleeping across doorways like a stubborn rug. I did not say much. I pressed the green notebook into a plastic sleeve and placed it on a shelf where my grandchildren could see it. Respect the land? That was the lesson. Listen to what it already knows. When a reporter asked for a final comment, I looked across the field where the ground had swallowed lies and said quietly, "Some land remembers. People should, too." If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful tales of karma and justice.